Are Lisa Daniels, Executive Director of the Darren Easterling Center for Restorative Practices. And joining us from the town of Greenville in southern Illinois is attorney Tom DeVore. He was the Republican candidate for Illinois Attorney General in 2022. We should also mention we invited members of the Illinois Prisoner Review Board as well as various representatives from law enforcement, including several suburban state's attorneys and a sheriff, as well as members of both the House and Senate GOP. They all declined our invitations. I am thankful to have the two of you, Lisa and Tom, to join us. Lisa, let's start with you, please. As we mentioned, nearly 2/3 of requests for release being denied. Do you think this law is living up to its promise?
Doesn't appear to be at this point in time. As a former member of the Prisoner Review Board, I spent many opportunity actually on panels and reviewing petitions as well. And there are often challenges in the deliberation process and the ability to reach a consensus when it comes to whether or not someone should be released, in spite of the fact that they meet the eligibility requirements to be released under the Joe Coleman Act.
In fact, you just left the Prison Review Board earlier this year, correct?
January, yes.
January of this year. And we know that in some of Richard Dykes' paperwork that he got from the Prison Review Board, I think it was the chairman who says just because you meet all the requirements, it does not necessarily automatically mean that you will be granted release. It just makes you eligible for consideration. Yeah. Tom DeVore, what circumstances or under what circumstances do you think someone should be granted release?
You know, that hypothetical in the abstract is really hard to apply, and you have a good answer. But I was going to say what you just said, that the chairman had pointed out, where meeting the eligibility requirements means that you can apply. Doesn't necessarily mean it'll be granted. Being granted is probably very fact-specific circumstances. So, you know, I don't know the gentleman's whole story that you just had given to me, the gentleman that been in prison for quite some time, committed murder, etc. Why any human being could be able to sympathize with his plight. You know, there's a balance to that as well from a society perspective, that he did get a sentence and that sentence is being carried out, and you know, someone lost their life, etc. So I don't pretend to think that's an easy job, being on that Prison Review Board. I'm sure it's mired with a lot of emotion and politics and all of those things. So, you know, when they say this law is not meeting its expectation, the law is what it is. It's a law, which means it's a tool that can be utilized for people to apply. But whether or not they're granted it, it's not so much about the law, it's about the politics of it.
And we might come back to that in a little bit as well, Tom, before we let you both go. Lisa, what are some of the factors that members of the PRB are supposed to consider when considering a medical release request?
Well, of course, the criteria that is stated in the statute, and as you stated earlier, whether or not this person has a terminal illness, whether or not they'll be incapacitated or are incapacitated currently, or whether or not they'll be incapacitated over within the period of 6 months. And then there's also the parole plan, meaning what provisions does this person have in place to care for themselves or be cared for upon release. And the interesting thing is that, as I understand the law itself and the criteria and the eligibility for being able to apply, there is no other criteria. There are no other factors to consider. There is room to hear from the victim or surviving family members, to have an opportunity to express their thoughts and their feelings about whether or not this person should be released, as in clemency. But there are no other factors per the statute that say that the Prisoner Review Board should consider these things in making their decision.
So it's left up to the discretion of the panelists.
Exactly, and that's actually in the guidelines, that it is whether or not this person is granted or denied is at the sole discretion of the Illinois Prisoner Review Board.
So this Medical Release Act, it was also touted as an effective way to reduce the high cost of caring for elderly and obviously those who need a great deal of medical care in prison. Tom, is releasing people who are incarcerated under those circumstances, is that a smart way for the state to save money?
I'm not convinced. I'm not saying it is or isn't, because again, those types, before I became a lawyer, I was a finance person. So the precariousness of money complicated. And for example, if I use a hypothetical that would say we have someone that's elderly, been there for quite some time, they're incurring medical costs in prison, they haven't worked in a couple of decades, and if they do meet the factors and they're let out by the Prison Review Board, they're not going to go get a full-time job with private insurance, et cetera. So those costs are likely going to be borne by the taxpayers through some other mechanism. So I would not automatically jump on the bandwagon of if we let them out through this process, it's going to alleviate the taxpayer from carrying those costs. It may just shift it to another fund or another pool of tax dollars, but I wouldn't say that it's an automatic tax savings. No, I wouldn't.
Lisa, does keeping prisoners with serious health conditions incarcerated, is that burdening the prison system that is already, I think a lot of people would argue, strapped?
I would say that it would be, because there are people, again, who are incapacitated that are now left to be cared for and having a lot of their daily needs met, and that becomes a burden on staff, on the correction staff, versus medical staff. And so now there's this expectation of correction staffs to do things that are outside of the scope of their the scope of their job description.
I would also imagine the impact on public safety is something that panelists, board members consider when considering an application.
Yeah, we've always considered that, and again, that's something to think about when you think this person, to the gentleman's point, is elderly, has been incarcerated for more than 20 years in most cases, and more often than not poses absolutely no threat to public safety if released.
Okay, so I did say we wanted to talk about the politics a little bit. Prison Review Board supposed to be roughly evenly split between Republicans and Democrats. In an explainer for those at home, we've mentioned it. Each release request is decided by a panel of just 3 board members of the greater board. Data shows, though, and as we mentioned, this information comes from Injustice Watch and WBEZ, that Republicans are casting more votes than Democrats, and that they are more likely to deny a request for release. Lisa first, and then I'm going to come to you as well, Tom. But once you sat on the Prisoner Review Board, did you ever experience board members who seemed to be ideologically opposed to releasing people who are incarcerated?
Absolutely, absolutely. I've always said that it's my belief that the board votes its ideology. The board votes what they believe, and in spite of there being criteria that need to be, or the statutes that need to be considered when making decisions on whether or not somebody's going to be released or clemency is going to be granted, there's always an opportunity to fit my belief system into the guidelines of the statute. If the statute that we are to consider, one of the statutes that we are to consider is that does releasing this person deprecate the seriousness of the crime? There's no criteria for that. There's no evidence. It's all subjective. And so if I believe that a person deserves a second chance, then my rationale is simply, I do not believe that releasing this person would deprecate the seriousness of the crime. My decision falls under the statute.
Tom, your thoughts on politics and how they might play into some of the decisions that the PRB makes?
Ms. Daniels just made a variety of excellent points, of which I agree with her on. The factors. There's 6 of them actually, and none of them specifically discuss what she just mentioned. But that's the human condition, and you'll see it in the justice system. You'll see it in the judiciary in general, where ideology of people can influence their decisions, because it's a very broad range of discretion. I would point out that prior to this law being passed, there was a similar method through clemency. The governor, through the executive branch, made those decisions. And I would humbly suggest at least consider, I'm not saying it's true, I'm saying consider that passing this law was a way to shift the complexity of this issue, which is very complex, to the Prison Review Board, because maybe the executive office didn't want to make these difficult decisions, because the ideology can be so heated on both sides. For example, the gentleman that we just
Sorry, we're fresh. Sorry, Tom,
Okay,
we're
go
fresh
ahead,
out of
that's fine.
time.
Okay.
Obviously, the three of us can talk about this a lot more,
Yeah, we
and
could.
perhaps this conversation will continue another
Yeah, we
time, but
could.
we'll have to leave it there. Tom DeVore and Lisa Daniels, thanks to you both.
Thank you very much.
Up next, something a little bit lighter.